I do. Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us for our next group TLC TA intervention, change strategies, designing to shift organizational culture, mindsets, and skill sets. And as your coaches have been working with each one of you, it seems that many of you have moved forward from the learning phase in LI Squared to more of the innovate. And we want to have this conversation today to talk about what's the next steps. How do you embrace and engage your organization and change your organizational culture? And how do you get buy-in so that your changes will last? So I'm going to turn this over to John, who will get more information to you. Thank you, John.
Great. Thanks so much, Lisa. And good afternoon, everyone. With the exception of you Pacific Coast folks, good morning. And I'm John, for those of you that I may not have met before, Senior Analyst at Mathematica and part of the broader BLH team working with OFA to support this TANF learning community. We are going to talk about change strategies today and a quick overview of what we'd like to achieve. First and foremost, I hope that you walk away understanding what change strategies are, like what does that term actually mean, and how could you begin developing them. The second is that I've invited some colleagues from the New York City Human Resources Administration and Iowa's Family Development and Self-Sufficiency Program, otherwise known as FaDSS, not a fad, but FaDSS, about their experience developing change strategies. And so you're going to get to hear from Dina and Page, and I think that'll be a really helpful experience because they are in shoes very much like yours and can speak to what that's like. So I'm going to share just a little bit of content up front to frame this up and then get out of the way and let Dina and Paige talk about their work. And then we're going to move into some breakout discussions. And we'll also take any questions you have for our guests. Then we'll move into breakouts. We're going to have 2 breakouts so that everybody gets a chance to talk to New York and Iowa. We will switch after about 15-20 minutes so that regardless of what breakout room you end up in, your second 20 minutes will be with the other site team. And that is the plan for today. So let me jump in and kind of prime our content for today. If you have questions as we're going along, please don't hesitate to put a question in the chat. So this should look pretty familiar to folks. If it doesn't, gosh, I have failed. But we have shown the roadmap for change at multiple points, and hopefully you've been talking about it with your coaches to some degree. The roadmap for change is a much more streamlined version of a logic model. And the roadmap is used in this work to map out what are we going to do, how are we going to change the system, the behaviors, the mindsets, the skill sets of people so that that thing actually happens, and then what are the measurable real world outcomes of that change? Solution, change strategies, outcomes. And then the way that you kind of develop those change strategies is you have to think about what is influencing the solution. What are those factors that are going to help and hinder your efforts? So mapping out the influencers helps you say, okay, well, if our solution is a new case management model, well, what's going to help us implement that new model? What about our organizational culture? What about our staff skills? What about the way that we are able to work with our participants, the time limits, the number of times we meet with them, things like that? There could be factors that help and hinder, and whatever that list looks like, then you can think about that red box, the change strategies. What are we going to do in response to those factors to change mindsets, behaviors, and skill sets? Quickly, I see your question in the chat, Elaine. Yes, everybody will get a copy of these slides, so we'll make sure that that makes its way to you. Obviously, today we're focused on the change strategies bucket, and I want to unpack how you get there. So 2 ways I want to highlight this. One is to think about change at the system level. The other is to think about change at the individual level. And so let's start with the system, right? Within a system, there are lots and lots of individuals. Some systems have more individuals than others. Individuals have knowledge and skills, right? Individuals have beliefs, they have motivation, they have self-efficacy. Individuals have a readiness for change. They identify with the organization to some extent or another. But those individuals sit within a broader context. And if we haven't accounted for that broader context, then we can't implement any change, whether it's a new form that we want to use or it's overhauling your entire workforce development strategy. No matter how macro or micro you're going with your change here, we have to think about individuals within a specific context. And so I like to think of it as both an inner context and an outer context. So let's start with the inner context first. That individual sits within an organization or a team. That team or organization has certain structural characteristics, right? What are your standard operating procedures? What's the internal network, the way in which people communicate and coordinate with one another? Lots of that may be formal, lots of it may be informal. When you need something done, when you need a referral to another agency, is it just sort of a relationship-based thing, or are you actually using a form and a process to do it? That broader organizational culture and climate is also really important. What are the norms, the values, the principles that thread through the way that staff think about their participants, the way that staff interact with and talk to one another, the way that leadership and supervisors interact with staff? Is it a top-down organization? Is it a bottom-up organization? What does the culture look like? Who are the leaders and what skills do they have? How do they interact within the organization? What resources are available? And of course, a big favorite in the TANF world, what are the policies and the procedures and how do those affect what we're trying to do? If you want to roll out 2-generational programming, we might need to think about how our policies help us get there. What are the things within federal, state, county, and even organizational policy and procedures that support us engaging both adults and kids? And what are the things that get in our way? What are the procedures about the way that we operate our TANF employment services that might not be conducive to a child being the focus of service delivery? So there's lots of factors within that inner context, and there I want you to think about your organization, agency, or team. The next layer out would be thinking about the outer context, your community, the priorities and the resources that exist within your community. That could be regionally, could be at the county level, could be a city. All of that's valid, right? We just want to think about how those factors might be affecting what you're trying to do. External pressures or incentives, right? Maybe there's some sort of political shift going on, or there's been, I don't know, a recent scandal in the community that is affecting the way in which your TANF program is able to make changes. Those types of pressures or maybe incentives to do things differently could be factors in the change that you're trying to achieve. What's going on in the sort of local talk and the newspaper, things like that. Like all of that may exert some pressure. Connectedness with other organizations could be important. Many of you exist within or have communities under your state systems that involve many organizations, right? So what is the relationship between county and district agencies and nonprofit service providers or contracted service vendors? How do they interact with one another? And how does that affect the change that you're rolling out? You have to account for multiple organizational cultures and contexts, each of which might need its own set of strategies to help people change and adopt what you're trying to do. Finally, of course, there's the federal and state policies that are flowing down to the local level, and those may be helping or hindering your change. So when you're planning your roadmap, be sure to think about not just what's happening at the individual level, but also what's happening in at least these 2 other layers, and coming up with a list of what's going to help, what's going to hinder. Now let's talk about the individual level, which is often where we tend to focus, and I think can still benefit from some intentionality. So whatever your solution is, whether it's a 2-generational approach, whether it's a new case management model, whether it's trying to re-engage participants from the waivers that existed under the height of the pandemic, you have some sort of a solution that you're already defining or that you plan to define. And from that solution, these questions on the left-hand side of my screen should have answers, or at least you should be working toward answers, right? What needs to change? If we're doing something different, what is it about the way that we're currently doing things that will need to change? Who needs to change as a result of that? When do they need to change? Where do they need to change? How often and with whom? The answers to those questions then can help you think about the capabilities of individuals, the opportunities, or what's going on around those individuals, and the motivation of those individuals. This is based on the COM-B framework, which is out of the implementation science literature, and it helps us break down these 3 dimensions of individual change. Right? If any one of us is going to make a change in our lives, we need the capability to make that change, we need the opportunity to make that change, and we need some degree of motivation, whether it's intrinsic or extrinsic. And so as you think about that change with your team, right, maybe you want to roll out a coaching model with your staff. Does your team have the capabilities? Do they need to be equipped and built up and trained in those knowledge, skills, and abilities? Maybe. They might also need mentoring. They might also need peer support. In terms of opportunities, what opportunity do they have to coach? This is a huge one. I mean, I've supported a lot of coaching rollouts. Opportunities is one of the biggest hinder factors. Coaches are saying, I don't have time to coach because I have A, B, C, D, and E that I have to complete in terms of paperwork or process steps in my 60-minute meeting. That leaves approximately 4 minutes to do coaching. So how do we revise that? So the opportunities piece, what's going on around the individual that would allow them to take this desired action or make this change? And how could we facilitate that? That's a change strategy. And finally, motivation. What are the beliefs that people hold, the mindsets that people hold? Right? If you're trying to roll out a coaching model and there's an implicit or maybe an explicit belief that the best way to get a TANF participant to succeed, right, is to kind of make sure that they're doing their work participation hours, then that's going to result in a coaching approach that actually is less about coaching and more about making sure the hours are met, right? And we've talked about this before in prior sessions. What is the primary motivator? If that's the motivator, do we need to shift it a little bit? Because the motivation might need to be, how do we engage that person in terms of their goal and what's most important to them? And then let's figure out what types of work activities would align. So there's lots of subtle things at the individual level that may need to be uncovered and unpacked to figure out, how do we get this thing to work? And I promise, if you do this work on the front end and you ask your staff and you ask the families that you're serving and you ask your community partners and you ask a former participant who went through the program a year ago to help you dissect some of these factors that would get in your way and that would support the change you're making, you will save yourself a lot of implementation grief, because you can start to design for and proactively plan for those types of hiccups. So let me give you a couple of examples of what I mean. As I've already said, let's imagine that part of your innovation or your solution is a new participant coaching approach. You want to roll out a coaching model. Great, so what might be a hinder factor to that component of your innovation? Maybe it's the mindset among some or many of your staff that this won't last. It's just the director's flavor of the day. That's a real thing, right? I've seen that show up in a lot of places. That could get in the way of implementation. But when you look at that, by and large, the single biggest change strategy that teams want to use and reach for is training, right? If we want to roll out a coaching model, then what we need to do is train the team on the coaching model. Really good, robust training. And then they come back and they implement what they were trained on, right? But this hinder factor is almost certainly not going to be solved by training. And that's important to recognize. That's why change strategies are complicated. This is a mindset. This relates to individual motivation and maybe organizational context, which is that inner context I was talking about. And so the change strategy might actually need to be something along these lines. And these are actual change strategies that came from actual TANF programs. incorporating the key coaching skills from the training, like what are the skills needed to use this approach, and how do I, as the supervisor, start to raise those in performance reviews and regularly revisit those skills through observations and follow-up during the year. Second, maybe the director of the agency, right, who is in that leadership position, starts to use the same coaching approach with her direct reports and expects the same of them. That starts to shift culture because it says, myself, the manager, the director of this agency, I'm going to use this approach. I expect you to use it, and I expect you to use it with your participants. Finally, a third might be supervisors signal that participant feedback on their coaching experience is going to become an important accountability measure. All right, so the program is starting to say it's not all that matters, but if we're going to start coaching and actually change the way we do business, we need to hear from our families about their experience with coaching, and that will become a factor in how we support and evaluate you as a staff person. In addition to some of these other measures and performance indicators, that starts to change the incentive structure and the culture of the organization. So notice how the change strategies are directly related to people believing that this is not going to last. These change strategies are about integrating it into the infrastructure and the culture and the operations of the program. It's not about training, even though training might be necessary. Second example, maybe part of your innovation component is co-enrollment in TANF and WIOA. You want to get your participants benefiting from both funding streams. The hinder factor here, maybe, is an explicit or implicit belief that TANF participants, quote, bring down the WIOA performance measures. What are the potential change strategies to that hindrance? Again, training is probably not going to address that. That's more of a mindset and motivation issue, maybe a little bit of an opportunity issue if we're talking about the types of barriers and personal challenges that those families are experiencing. So what could the change strategies look like? Well, maybe it's thinking about the incentives. How do we incentivize WIOA staff to co-enroll at TANF at higher rates? That could be something monetary or non-monetary wise that we try to get staff focused on. Let's get TANF participants enrolled, and not in a transactional way, in a meaningful way. And we want to incentivize you for serving them with excellence. Second potential idea here could be sharing biweekly success stories with all staff of co-enrolled participants, right? Just to try to shift that culture that, oh, TANF participants are bringing down the performance measures. Well, no, look, every other week, we're highlighting a way in which this TANF participant really succeeded with the co-enrollment strategy, and they were able to meet the measures, and we can celebrate that, shifting the story and the narrative. Finally, maybe you create a new role, a WIOA engagement lead who supports the workforce advisor serving TANF participants with significant challenges. So my point here is, when you're thinking through the change strategies, set training to the side. Don't reach for the obvious choice, because training only solves so much. Your change strategies need a deliberate and thoughtful design around what's going to help us, what's going to hinder us. That's going to get you at, how do I shift those mindsets within my team, within my partners? How do I equip them with the right skills, maybe through training, but also through mentoring, through supervisor and peer support, to exhibit the behavior that I want them to exhibit? How do I change the environment or the structure or the policies within my organization or my community to facilitate that? So let me pause and see if there are any immediate questions before we move to the panel. Feel free to unmute. I can't see very many of you because I'm sharing my screen, or pop something in the chat. All right, nothing burning. So let's go ahead and move on to our panel of peers. I want to introduce my colleagues here. Dina from New York City Human Resources Administration, and Page We initially thought that Lori Easter would be joining, but Paige is solo representing here. And sorry, I realized, Paige, there is a typo in your name. No I. My apologies. So I'd love for each of you to introduce yourselves a little bit about your position, your agency, and what your program does, just to give us a little bit of context. Dina, would you like to go first?
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dina Marie Zagari-LiMandri, and I'm the Assistant Deputy Commissioner for Education and Youth Services at the Human Resources Administration of New York. The Human Resources Administration of New York is the largest social service agency in the nation. And I am under the division which we call Career Services, which is a small division under a much larger Employment Support Services division of the Human Resource Administration. The main focus of what we do is connect cash assistance clients to education, training, internships, and employment so that they can meet their required mandated work activity through any one of those arenas. And that's sort of the main push of the area I work in.
Thanks, Dina. Paige?
Hi, everyone. I'm Page Humphrey. I'm a program manager in the Department of Human Rights. I work in the FaDSS program. FaDSS is the Family Development and Self-Sufficiency Program. It's a home visitation program that serves low-income families in all 99 counties in Iowa. It's funded with both federal TANF dollars and state appropriations. It's just a very unique program because it's statewide and because the services are provided to the participants in their home. We also work with the entire family. We help them assess their current situation and then set goals. We look at 14 areas or domains of self-sufficiency, things like income, employment, childcare, parenting, transportation, and other critical aspects of well-being. But at the Department of Human Rights, we contract out with 15 providers who provide the direct services to the family. So I work at the state level, and then we contract with 15 providers at those agencies that we work closely with coordinators or supervisors who oversee the frontline staff who are called family development specialists.
Great. So could each of you share just a little bit about the recent change that your organization's made? What was the impetus for that change? Give us a little bit of detail about the innovation or the intervention, if you will.
Sure. So several years back, my supervisor at the time outreached to Mathematica to take a look at our career pathways program. Similar to what Paige mentioned, we have contracted providers in New York City, non and for-profit organizations that serve our TANF population in helping them to connect to education and training and employment. And part of the steps that a client would go through is first they would go to one of the HRA job centers to help get them out of crisis. And then once they're out of crisis and getting the supports they need, the next step is to be referred to one of our career or youth pathway providers. But in between that step, there is an assessment process. Something like a 90-question assessment that has to be answered. And we recognize that even though we were saying we wanted to be person-centered and client-focused, what we were doing is we were sort of torturing our clients with these long, drawn-out, often trauma-inducing assessments. And you know, to add to that, we were hearing it not only from our clients, but we were hearing it from our providers and our own staff, feeling the weight of this assessment process. But the assessment was is connected to all of these systematic triggers that connect people to resources and services. So it's deeply embedded in our system, and it's wrapped around some policies. And we knew things had to change. And so prior to the pandemic, we came together with Mathematica to talk about what would we like to see happen, what would be the ideal. And one of the first things that was clear is that we all agreed, the clients, the providers, HRA staff, something needs to change. This is too long and it's too much. And when we came together, we started there on that ground. And then what ensued beyond that was a 2-year through the pandemic process to redesign our assessment and the processes that surround it. And that's the best way to sort of sum it up.
Great. Thanks, Dina. Paige, how about you guys?
Well, we have collaborated with Mathematica and the Adjacent Possible in tackling 2 big challenges in the program. The first opportunity that we tried out the LI² method was presented to us during the pandemic, actually. As I mentioned earlier, FaDSS is a home visitation program, and so we were forced very quickly to adjust our model and switch to providing solely virtual services for a period of time. As we started to discuss returning to in-person services, we were learning that there were aspects of virtual service delivery that might make a lot of sense to keep in our program, and aspects that we definitely wanted to leave behind. And so we used that process to learn and come up with basically a policy that we're implementing today. And then through that process, we also learned, just in hearing from our staff, that there was a real disconnect between the fidelity measures in our program, which we as program administrators thought are really important, and the things that the specialists actually do with the families that they view as being important, and what do they think really makes a difference. The state comes in, they do a monitoring, they say, here's the standards you met, here's the standards you didn't meet, and then the specialists are kind of left like, well, we have to check these boxes to keep these people happy during this monitoring, but we know what our real work with families is, and that's not being measured. So there's this really clear disconnect. And so we started a new learn phase around that informed us that basically, like, we all wanted the same thing, which was meaningful, effective services and a clear way to show that they're being delivered. So that was our innovation. We're kind of still in the second half of that. We're working through that now, but we did roll out a new hybrid model for service delivery.
Great. So I'd love to get to the meat of the issue now that we've laid the foundation. What were some of those help and hinder factors that either your teams identified proactively or that you saw come up as you began to roll out these changes? Maybe you could highlight 1 or 2. And what types of strategies did you use to address, either to build up the help factors or maybe address some of those hinder factors?
Sure. I think the first thing is you have to identify people within your organization that are champions of this kind of work, right? And you have to sort of enlist them to work potentially on a project that's not going to bring them any additional money or resources, and definitely more work, and they'll be okay with that because they believe in it. So you need to find people who, as Jonathan mentioned earlier, have the intrinsic motivation to want to pursue this. So that's I think the first part of it, and that's sort of figuring out who those people are. And that's what I did. I sort of compiled a team that was a sort of a mishmash of people of different areas and different areas of expertise, a couple of interns, and we put a team together to drive the assessment redesign project. You know, another win is that our leadership was already sort of behind this in, you know, in theory, right? They were really like supportive of watching it happen. But as with New York City government and mayoral requests for data and information, you have to keep leadership.
Howard is here.
You have to keep our leadership sort of updated with regular frequency, and New York City likes to see progress very quickly, right? We want to see what's happening. When is this going to be implemented and ready? So that's both a challenge and a plus. We have the support, but with that support comes what's going on. Give us the updates. When is this when will this be done? When will this be ready? And sort of being part of this process, one of the things that I was really grateful about, probably a positive side effect of the pandemic, is it gave us the time and space to take a little bit more time with this, because services in New York City, as with many other areas, was on pause. And so that allowed us to spend a little more time diving deeper into this. And then some of the obvious IT and system challenges, policy and procedures. Those are real challenges. And, you know, again, being able to show data and evidence quickly, right? And there are some tools we can talk more about that actually were really helpful in that process. But those were some of the pluses and.
Great, thanks, Dina.
We took a little bit different approach. We had saved some money in our program by not traveling as much because of the pandemic. And so we did provide a little bit of additional funding for people who who were selected to participate on an implementation team to kind of roll out our supervision project. And we chose people to be on that team. We wanted the champions, but we also wanted the naysayers, the people who are always like kind of stirring the pot when we say we're gonna, you know, there's a new change coming. They're the ones rolling their eyes and like kind of dragging their feet. They don't want to do anything different, but they still find things to complain about. So we wanted those people too. We wanted, you know, if we can bring them along, we can get anybody. So we chose people who we thought were influential, you know, amongst their peers, a variety of attitudes, I guess, or outlooks, and then a range of experience. So we selected a group of 4 out of our 15 supervisors. Well, we had 5, one moved on, but we ended up with 4. And then we just created a team. And so it wasn't the state and then the local level. It was, this is the implementation team. We're all on this team together, and we're going to go through this work as a group, which I think really helped. They're the ones overseeing the program on a day-to-day basis. We need to look to them to tell us what's working, what's not working. You know, we can look at the core components of the program that are important, things like building trust, engaging families, you know, doing good goal setting, that kind of thing. But we really need to know what, as a supervisor, what do you look for in your staff to know that they're doing these things well? What behaviors are, you know, what are they showing you? Where are you finding this? So I think in building that team where we're, you know, all participating as equals, really help to do this together collaboratively, rather than like, we're putting this in your contract that you have to do these meetings and these things, which we did have a contract because we gave them a little additional funding, but the way we presented it, I think, helped that.
I have a question. My name is Jeremy Reed. I'm from Anne Arundel County and in Maryland. And what I was wondering is, did you incorporate staff the direct line staff who are dealing with the customers on a daily basis in this panel as well too?
We used a lot of the frontline staff feedback, and we're at the point now where we're looking, we've taken what they gave us in our learn sessions, and we're making a stepping stones, a supervision tool using a goal for it model. And so we're gonna get their feedback on it. We're just still creating, making that tool specific to our program. But we have engaged not only the frontline staff, but also families to get their feedback, which in the learn phase of this, we spent a lot of time interviewing families, doing learn sessions with specialists who work directly with the families, and then also conducting surveys.
And were the families, how responsive were the families? Did they provide?
Yeah, they're very
input in that. Okay.
The good thing about our program is most people love it, and so we get a lot of we have really high response rate for our surveys, and so we got a lot of survey responses, and then we also were able to just select a diverse group of families who had participated in the program and get their feedback too. So those we try to get a geographic, people from different parts of the state, two-parent families, single-parent families, people with younger kids versus older, just to get, we just kind of picked who we could, we reached out to a lot of people and got several to respond, and so we did one-on-one interviews with them. They were very responsive. I think getting family feedback is not something new in our program. Our local agencies, get a lot of feedback and input from families. So I think the families were kind of used to that. But for some programs, I know that's not very common, so it can be more difficult.
So you created your own survey then, with open-ended questions or closed-ended, or a combination?
Some of them were what county do you live in? Some were closed-ended, and then some were rating, a scale, and then some we just asked them to share feedback. We used SurveyMonkey, and then we had, I think we created a link and then texted out the link because most of our families communicate with their specialists over the phone, some through email, but a lot of texting as they're setting up appointments or visits. And so I think that was part of why we got a really good response rate. Some of our partner programs, other state agencies don't use texting, but I know that in our program it's been really effective.
Yeah, this
Thank you.
This is an excellent example of how you sort of address those factors through an engagement, whether it's by bringing staff or families onto your implementation team or engaging them through a data collection exercise like Paige is talking about. And Jeremy, I appreciate you raising that. And I would invite others, if you have questions along these lines, the breakouts are going to be additional space for you to get really in the weeds of what was your Likert scale page on those surveys. Feel free to get into the weeds with these guys. I wanted to make sure though in this full group setting that we got to maybe one or two other questions. And I also wanted to just kind of connect the dots here because I think Paige and Dina, you both articulated some similar challenges and different ways of approaching it. Right. And so Paige, in your space, you were really kind of seeing this, the need to get some buy-in and get people on board to commit to the change. I know one of the biggest hinder factors that teams I've worked with articulate is capacity. We can barely do the things that we're required to do every day. How do we take on this whole other change initiative when nobody's giving us more hours to work. And so you guys decided, hey, let's incentivize that monetarily. Some programs might have that option. I'm guessing many programs don't have that option. So what else could you do? I love the way that Dina's team approached that, right? We've got to look for those intrinsically motivated internal champions, the people who are going to be self-motivated and help to motivate other people because they're so committed to the change. When we operate in such a chaotic and stressful environment, like that commitment to the change process, I think is so pivotal. And so I wanted to highlight that because I think both of you talked about implementation teams. Both of those teams are addressing hinder factors of, we don't have the time for this. We don't have the commitment for this right now because there's so much other stuff going on. Get a dedicated group of people incentivized to focus on this and make it a #1 priority. Last thing I wanted to pose to you guys and then see if anyone else has questions in this full group space. What would be one piece of advice to this group of 10 TANF programs, right? We've got states, we've got county agencies, we've got tribal TANF programs represented here, all pursuing a variety of different change initiatives. You know, my friends in Anne Arundel County are thinking about big changes to sanction policy and coaching model. My friends in Larimer County are thinking about figuring out a new way to provide internships and work across multiple government agencies. Up in North Dakota, they're thinking about revising a pay after performance policy and replacing it with a new way of doing accountability. And I could go on, right? So everybody's doing something a little bit different. But as they are in this innovate phase and really starting to work toward what are we going to change and how are we going to change it, what would be your kind of key piece of advice to these leaders, Dina and Paige?
You know, I would say first, you should have a plan or a strategy for sharing back progress with the people at your government organization that are going to ask for updates, right? And you should plan to share those updates about how things are going before they'll even ask, right? And that's one of the strategies. Like every so often I would say to Mathematica and adjacent POS, I think it's time to update my leadership now. And I would do that before I knew the ask was coming down the pike, right? So I would say, let's do a debrief for my leadership to let them know where we are now. And that was really helpful to keep the momentum and the support because they were looped in. And it wasn't just me going back to my leadership and saying, this is where we're at, this is what we're doing. It was me and another person within my organization that's responsible for evaluation and research that partnered with me on this. So they covered the data, I covered the success stories and sort of the qualitative information. But it was also Mathematica and adjacent possible, and even some of our contracted providers speaking up and saying, look at what we've accomplished so far. So telling the story. And I also would say that the beautiful thing about the Learn and you know, innovate and, you know, and improve process is that there is room and space for mistakes. In fact, that's what rapid cycle evaluation is about. Let's make the mistakes now so that if we want to do a full-scale pilot or implementation strategy, let's make some little mistakes and test this out in small, quick ways now. And I feel like that was a huge, for me, a huge takeaway. And it was a good lesson for everyone involved to learn, because we were able to sort of fail together and learn together and improve together.
I totally agree, Dina. And you know, our leadership, well, I guess I kind of am the leadership, we had a lot of buy-in, and it was important to also give the feedback and tell the story of like, we started here, here's what we were trying to do, and now look at us, we're over here, and what have we learned, and what have we accomplished, and how is this impacting the families and the programs. And I think that's important because we do get kind of bogged down in our own schedules and our own work and, you know, these meetings, and then we lose sight of, like, a year ago, we didn't have any of this. We didn't know what we were doing. We were just, you know, kind of grasping at things to try because we knew that continuous quality improvement was important, but we didn't have a framework for that. So I think it's important to be updating the leadership to keep their buy-in, but also the people that you're bringing along who are going to be rolling out the changes, those direct staff, you know, to help them see, like, that you're part of this bigger movement and this shift and this change in our organization. And you contributed to this. It's not just another change that a policymaker's, you know, handing down another thing you have to do. And I think also for me, it was really important to not make assumptions. Like, I'm like, let's go. I want to do stuff now. Like, I know what we need to do and I want to do it. And, like, just kind of, like, taking the time, slow it down a little bit, make sure you do, you know, get all your information, and then, you know, get the feedback, the good, the bad, everything in between, and make those little tweaks. And it's okay to not have it perfect. You know, that's part of the process. You're gonna continue to innovate and improve, and you'll do it as a team together. You don't have to, like, sell one big idea and then if something goes wrong, feel like the weight is, you know, all on you.
Great. We've got a couple minutes before we move into the breakouts where you have a lot more time with Dina and Paige, but does anybody want to ask a question here, clarifying anything or something you've been thinking about? All right, well then, in that case, I am going to keep us moving right along. Casey Gray has been working on some breakouts. We are going to send you all into randomized breakouts. Each of them will be 20 minutes long to just discuss this more amongst, right, our TANF learning community, but also to have the benefit of Dina and Paige with us in those groups as well to answer questions or further reflect on their experience. So rather than having everybody mix up after the first breakout, Dina and Paige are just going to swap, and that'll make it easy. So we're going to move in there. We're going to leave from the second breakout at 3:30 Eastern time, so no need to come back to the full group at 3:30 or when the discussion is wrapped up. Feel free to just drop off.